it's often suggested that despite the benefits that come from the EU environmental legislation, the EU's common agricultural policy has been a disaster for the environment. And I certainly wouldn't try and argue that it's been great. But I think you have to remember a couple of things. Firstly, that before we joined, Britain was putting huge amounts of subsidy into agriculture. It was funding the grubbing up of hedgerows, drainage, etc. And the process of agricultural intensification was going on apace in the 60s, 50s. So there wasn't a golden age in which Britain was able to go it alone and agriculture wasn't having an impact on the environment. The early days of the CAP, until relatively recently, undoubtedly were not good for the environment. Production subsidies and so on. That has changed quite a lot under British influence, in fact. And so we have had so-called decoupling of production from subsidy, and the beginnings, at least, of paying for societal benefits, and particularly environmental benefits. So there has been significant reform of the CAP. I think you also have to just step back and say, well, what would happen if we left? And you don't have to sort of speculate very much about that, because the evidence is pretty much there. Firstly, I think it would be really naive to believe that the Treasury wouldn't want to cut agricultural subsidy very considerably. They've spent 40 years arguing for a reduction in the cost of the common agricultural policy. They're hardly going to stop if we left the EU. So there would, I think, undoubtedly be a very quick decline in the total amount of subsidy, and I suspect that what would then happen would be that as a way of sweetener for the farmers, if you like, the various agri-environment schemes and things like cross-compliance would quickly start to disappear. And you don't need, again, to speculate about that, because that's exactly what the Agriculture Minister himself has said, that cross-compliance, for example, would go. So I think that we would see actually real damage to the growing way of working together between environment and agriculture if we were to leave. In summary, let's not think that there was a golden age before we joined, and let's not think that somehow or other, if we had control over our own agricultural policy, it would become very environmental and green. I really don't think there's any evidence to suggest that at all.